Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining Devo and DeepSeas in our webinar today discussing how we navigate through the SIEM consolidation and three must-ask questions when you are evaluating your current stack and maybe a potentially new stack. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jason Michael. I'm the field CTO for Devo, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Paul Dwyer. He is a partner at DeepSeas. Thank you for joining with me, Paul.
Good morning, Jason. Thanks for the invite. It's good to talk to you today.
So what we're going to talk about, just a little agenda. The SIEM market has, of course, been in some uncertain states lately. We've seen a lot of shakeup going on. And talking to organizations around the world, we're really starting to see this uncertainty snowballing. So we've come up with some three must-ask questions that organizations really need to ask themselves and their SIEM vendor to make sure everyone is aligned and making sure that the paths are on the same journey together. So what we're going to do is talk about the three must-ask questions around this. We're also going to talk about some steps that organizations need to take when they're determining, are they needing to stay in their current SIEM and are they happy with it, or is a new SIEM the right approach to take? And then we'll talk about some next steps. So beginning this off, right, as I mentioned in starting us off, the SIEM market is, of course, had a lot of shakeups recently with some mergers and some acquisitions, some organizations stepping out of that space to look at the future of where their organization is going. And it's absolutely caused uncertainty in the security operations centers around the planet. So we're going to talk about some of the things and how organizations can address this, their concerns. So we're going to go one through one here with Paul and I, and we're going to have some conversations about this first piece, which is why when we look at the SIEM marketplace, some of the top tier vendors that have been out there are now outdated. They're not innovating. They're not making new advancements to their technologies. So we're definitely seeing a decline of those legacy SIEM solutions. So Paul, I'm going to start with the first one when we're looking at some of these legacy providers and the statements that they're announcing that they're facing end of life of their technology.
Yeah, you mentioned also the lack of innovation. I think one of the things that we've seen in a number of vendor products, and this is something we saw going back 5, 6, 7 years ago, we started to see certain vendors underinvesting in their products. That is, we started to see the backlog of requests and enhancement requests starting to really escalate. And we started seeing that about 5, 6 years ago. But in definitely the last 3 or 4 years, we've really seen kind of the hockey stick on that where it's really ramped up. And that's really reflective of vendors understanding the complexity of the market and understanding what it takes to continue to maintain these products, the investments that are required, et cetera. They're not insignificant. And I think that was certainly a leading indicator that there were some issues going on in the market in terms of seeing vendors uniformly adding new capabilities, adding new types of detections, adding more integrations with other products, adding more advanced analytical capabilities, AI, machine learning. There was a lot of promises and a lot of discussion, but not a lot of execution. And I think it's been frustrating to a lot of clients that they haven't seen more evolution in the capabilities of these products. And I think, as you've said also, that now it's making a lot more sense that some of these products have come out and announced end of life, like some of the IBM products are going end of life and some of the other things. So it's definitely an area to be aware of and to be concerned and understanding kind of what's the roadmap for your product and how well is it sort of meeting your current requirements, let alone kind of what your requirements are that you're looking for the future. And if it hasn't been matching up, if they haven't been investing in it over the last few years, it's unlikely that magically that's going to turn around and suddenly you're going to get a lot of additional capability very quickly at a very low cost. That's unlikely to be the case. And I think this whole consolidation is causing everyone in the market to really kind of step back and look at what's the current product set, where am I positioned, how well is my current product meeting my requirements, and really kind of challenging people to analyze whether they're on the right platform for the long term or not.
100% agree. And that is bringing us into the next point that, when we're evaluating these and looking at these vendors, our attack surface is continuing to explode, and the telemetry sources that we're requiring to have visibility into is just overwhelming a lot of these legacy providers. They haven't really innovated or enhanced the capabilities to be able to handle today's data volumes that we have to actually depend upon. Now, we're going to talk deeper about this, of course, and there's a lot of challenges organizations have to make of, can I afford to throw everything? Or what do I really need? What's important to me? I don't want to just take everything that creates a log and shove it into the SIEM. But even with that perspective of, these are my hardcore required data sets to protect my organization, these legacy providers are still unable to keep up with that volume. What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Yeah, I think certainly the volume's an aspect. I think the vendors have always struggled with the high volume nature of this. I think one of the other things that we've seen in recent years is, as more and more products have come on the market that monitor aspects of security behavior, we've seen that proliferation. And one of the challenges that has is these vendors have to support an ever greater number of products. And as those products continue to evolve and change, one of the other issues that we've seen is the XML definitions of what's in those logs that we're trying to analyze. Those are constantly changing and shifting. And I think one of the other things we've seen is that even if you can get the data to ingest, which, as you said, is a problem from a volume standpoint, you've got to be sized correctly. But I think one of the other issues we've seen is the lack of discovery on the specific XML definitions, to the point where a lot of clients are forced to create their own custom XML definitions to be able to discover the data in the logs. So I think it's both a combination of the volume of data, the location of that data. We're going to talk about this in a second, but more and more of the data moving to the cloud, a lot of these tools were never architected with the cloud architecture in mind. So as a result, you end up with a cloud solution that has 20, 30, 40 local servers on-prem, and it certainly doesn't look or feel like a cloud solution when you have to have that many localized servers running in your own environment. So it is certainly a challenge, but I think some of the vendors have really stepped up and figure out ways to manage that and handle this. I think some of the other vendors have struggled with it, and we're seeing those vendors kind of falling behind in their investments and just kind of falling behind what the market is looking for in terms of capabilities.
Yes, so much true. So, if you look at a security operations center tech stack, it's continually growing. I mean, I think on average, SOC team has around 75 products in their arsenal that they depend upon, from some type of monitoring, detection, prevention, whatever the scenario might be. And you hit it right on the head. There's still a lot of those legacy engines out there that are on-prem. And these cloud providers, the new cloud providers that are coming out, they have adjusted and made the capabilities to ingest, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. But some of these legacy ones, they're looking at it like, well, everything has been on cloud when we built this thing. Everything's been on-prem when we built this thing, and that's how we've configured this thing to work. So when things are new data sources and new telemetry comes online that is in the cloud, they're struggling with that. So that is really showing that final fourth point of, these providers that are legacy providers, they just don't have the components to make sure that you're covered when it comes to data sources. What is your thoughts?
Yeah, you're right. You're right, Jason. They just were never architected understanding that eventually cloud's going to become the primary component to collect the data. And most of these products are really optimized for on-prem solutions. And even where they do support some cloud, it's challenging, it's difficult, it's expensive to configure, and it's expensive to operate and maintain.
100%. So we've started off with, some of these challenges that the legacy providers are experiencing. When we're going through all of these topics, everybody, please, if you have questions that come up or statements that you want to expand upon, please don't hesitate to put them in the message board so we can make sure they're addressed and answered for you. We want to make sure everyone's questions are covered. So when we're looking at, this big shift that we're dealing with right now, the consolidation of this SIEM market does introduce risks and opportunities on both sides of this landscape. And there's many things that organizations are starting to think about more and more when it comes to, where is my future going when it comes to enterprise logging and event management. And these are just a handful of them. This is not all encompassing, but there is a lot of things that people are very concerned about, whether it is from the risk or from the opportunity side. So the first one, of course, we're looking at, if I'm really looking at this consolidation and this new organization maybe that has taken over a legacy product, are they going to continue to innovate it, or are they going to just make sure everyone's shifted over into this new product that they're offering? And what does that introduce, right? Where is the interoperability of my existing tech stack? Is it going to continue to be stable for me? Is there going to be support issues if I do have a problem and I call the new vendor that's merged or acquired? What am I dealing with now? Am I getting the right answers, or am I getting stuck in a queue? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. I think for a lot of clients that have, again, these SIEM tools, they're not peripheral sort of products. I mean, these are the heart and soul of your security operations center. Now, I think historically, people have been overly reliant on the SIEM. So I think that's one of the opportunities. We're going to talk a little bit about the changing role of the SIEM platform, but the importance of the SIEM platform to any security operations center, it is the primary mechanism that they use to do the real-time analytics, or that's the primary purpose of the SIEM platform, most of them are optimized to do real-time analysis of those log sources. And again, if you've got issues ingesting the logs, if you've got issues discovering the data set, but also if you just have stability issues, things were working yesterday, they're not working today. Now we've got to spend time troubleshooting. I think SIEMs have become a tier 1 operational system, and they have to operate with a high degree of resiliency. They have to be highly capable. And again, I think the underinvestments that we've talked about previously are one of the reasons that we're not seeing the stability and the reliability of all of the products. And even some of the top tier products aren't as stable or reliable as they used to be. And then when you look at kind of what investments are being made, the costs that are escalating around this, in some cases, the way the pricing model works, you're almost penalized for using some of these tools versus, really kind of being in a partnership where there's a shared risk, shared reward in terms of leveraging these tools for your capabilities. But I think one of the biggest things is over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen these prices really go up. And if you haven't kind of stepped back and really said, have I really kind of revisited how I want to use the SIEM? What's the optimal way to use it? And can I use it in a way that I still get the full effect of it, but I'm not creating a high level of cost? And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities this market consolidation presents, is it lets us kind of step back, revisit what our requirements are for the SIEM platform, and try to say, look, I might want to reposition how I'm thinking about my SIEM. Maybe I don't want the SIEM to be the only or the primary mechanism for identifying threats in the environment. It might be one of several tools that I'm using to detect threats in the environment. And I think that's one of the big shifts that we're seeing, that the SIEM market consolidation, it's almost a function of that consolidation, but I think it's also one of the things that's been driving the market consolidation is the roles of these tools are changing as more and more security products. I think JC mentioned that the average company has 75 security products. A lot of those products can also generate security alerts. And the question becomes, if a product can already generate a security alert, do I redundantly feed the log into a SIEM tool and reanalyze it for those same things? Or do I kind of look at a different mechanism to be able to make sure I've got the right capabilities and detection coverage across all of my tools and platform? And I really start to get much more specialized and focused in terms of what's the role the SIEM's going to be in the environment. And by taking that approach, I think there are some opportunities to really reduce the cost of licensing the SIEM, provided you can kind of really re-envision how you want to be able to use the SIEM in your environment. But I think for a number of our clients, we've seen them be able to save not even small amounts of money, but several of our clients have been able to save several millions of dollars on their contracts and on their license agreements by kind of right-sizing the use of the SIEM platform. And that is kind of the bright side of this. The downside is a lot of organizations haven't planned for a SIEM migration. They don't know what's involved, the complexity of it, how long it's going to take. And I think that's one of the other things where I think working with some good professionals who have experience doing this, we can help understand how to frame the business case, how to frame, what's required to sort of make sure that you're operating on a platform that's going to really meet your requirements. And then also, how do you optimize that platform to make sure that you're paying the right amount given the value that you're driving from the product? So lots of opportunities, but lots of cost and complexity, and a lot of analysis that has to be done around that. But very, very doable work if you've had experience doing that.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that's another thing, like you touched base on, is there's so many of these technologies that have been innovated in keeping up with the current threat landscape and triggering their own types of alerts. I still think, like you touched base on, the changing role of the SIEM primarily is going to be more, I believe, around the correlation engine to make, to build out the attack story much more robustly, and case management and the operational flow behind that to be able to really conduct your investigations more efficiently and effectively, instead of just a centralized logging engine that just say and pump everything you got into it and figure it out once it's there. And that comes back into point number two is, some of these legacy vendors, they had good roadmaps. You touched base on this and very early. They had great roadmaps and they're like, we're going to do this and do that. We're meeting these requirements of the industry. But that list only got longer. It never got shorter. They never really executed on a lot of plans that they projected they were going to accomplish. So now organizations have to take a hard look at that and said, well, you promised me these 6, 7 features that are very important to me and my team, and we have yet to see any of them. How can I really be confident of any of your roadmap and what you're going to provide, not just me, but the industry at large? I mean, how do I have confidence level in that? So that's something that is definitely a risk, I think, for organizations that have the legacy providers. What do you think?
Yeah, and to your point, I think this risk continues to grow. I mean, we're not at the end of the market consolidation. We're at the front end of this market consolidation. So I think that market consolidation is going to continue to chase more of the current product set out of the market. And we're likely to see a smaller and smaller set of tools that end up kind of emerging as the ones that are going to be around for a longer term period. And you raise a really good point. I think the early SIEM tools tried to be everything to everybody. They tried to be both a SIEM tool, they tried to be a case management tool, they tried to do workflow, they tried to do automation. And suddenly it wasn't a SIEM tool anymore. It was, it was 15 different things trying to be jammed together. And I think as the complexity of those tools grew and the role got more complicated, some of the vendors tried to build it all in. And I think those are not necessarily the vendors that are going to survive. I think other vendors recognized, hey, look, we want to be excellent and phenomenal at the analytics and the threat detection, but we can't do that and be the best use case management platform and be a threat intelligence platform and, provide workflow and all these other capabilities. So I think more and more we're looking at the role of the SIEM is really in real-time threat detection. For smaller organizations, they still may use it to do a broad set of selection and use the broader capabilities. But I think more and more it's requiring companies to look at, how do I detect the threats? Then how do I manage the threats once I've identified them? And our, per our earlier discussion, if I have more and more tools that are capable of generating alerts, how do I consolidate and correlate those alerts in a more effective way and then manage them through the life cycle? And again, I think to your point, we're going to be looking at kind of the case management platforms or the SIEM tool saying, what is your event correlation, where you can take alerts from a lot of different tools that may not be indicative of a threat, but when I can combine them together with other indicators, now I can take several weak indicators, combine them together and have a strong indicator that on their own, maybe each one of these things may only be a 20 or 30% confidence level that I've got a threat. But when I combine these weak indicators together, when these 3 or 4 things all match up, now I know that I have something that's 70 or 80% indicative of a true threat that I have to go after, which helps us reduce the false positives, makes more effective use of the alerts happening in a lot of different locations. But it really is all about kind of breaking down those silos and integrating the information, and doing that event correlation is going to be more and more important as we move forward.
Yeah, and unfortunately, though, some of these legacy providers, again, promised to deliver, failed to execute on some of those specific requirements. And if they did deliver on a few of them, all that did was in turn increase your invoice or your monthly charges at the end of the month, whether it be charging for execution of playbooks, charging for more alert rules. I mean, they just kept adding and more price increases and more features and functionality, which makes everyone struggle. And that brings me into the fourth point, where I'm not seeing new things coming out. I'm seeing maybe a feature here and there, and now my price tag's gone up. So my SOC team is struggling first and foremost, and they don't really have confidence level in the technology that they're required to do their job. And then they get this uncertainty level that says, I'm measured on my MTTR, or I'm measured on my, how many alerts I can get through a day, whatever that situation might be in the stock, depending on your level. But at the end of the day, I mean, if they're not having the confidence in it, they're going to go elsewhere, and they're going to start going back to old school swivel chair IR, I used to call it, the copy and paste, where I got 16 screens open and I'm just copying and pasting from one to the other and not having that centralized, view. I hate to talk and bring up single pane of glass because that's something that's been committed or promised for years and never really delivered upon. But at the end of the day, we got to look at, if I don't have confidence in my vendor, why am I sticking with them? So again, that brings up, several of the points that we've been discussing. So in the essence of time, we're going to go into the next point, which is, you mentioned this, and I want to have you expand on this a little bit further around, the changing of the role of the SIEM in the SOC. Because like you mentioned, traditionally, and when this thing first came out, it was a centralized location to pump all your data. Well, as you mentioned, that role is changing significantly in the SOC today. And I want to get your insights on where you think it's going.
Yeah, I think in the early days, the people who were early adopters of the SIEM platforms, I think one of the lessons learned early on was that a lot of people who got into the SIEM kind of went full boat. Like they decided to put all of their data sources into the SIEM, whether they were going to analyze it or not. There was just kind of this mentality of, hey, if we've got any logs at all, any kind of data, let's put it through the SIEM. And again, in the early days of the SIEM, you weren't really sure what were the best log sources or what were the most important fields within those log sources that I should be analyzing. So the impression was, well, let's just put everything out there and we'll figure out if we need it later. The problem with that model of just kind of loading it up is, as a SOC analyst, my job is to try to find the needle in the haystack. And when you take that approach, all you've done is make the haystack enormous, which means every query I run, every search I do, every time I try to analyze, it's all taking longer and longer because I have this whole massive overhead of data that I'm not even using or analyzing that's clogging up my system, my environment. I'm paying for capacity to manage all this stuff, and I'm not really using all of those things. So I think, again, kind of stepping back and looking at how do I really want to use my SIEM? And I think in a lot of cases, some companies, especially smaller companies, have been kind of forced into a situation where they've had to use the SIEM to do their log analytics and their threat detection. And anytime you see the log analysis work coexisting with the cyber defense work, one of the things is the cyber defense work is going to end up taking a back seat to log analytics, that you're going to get requests to do things with those logs that don't really make sense anymore. And when you understand kind of what a mature cyber defense program looks like, doing log analytics for an application team should not be a priority for your cyber defense team. Those resources are expensive, they're limited. You really want to focus them on cyber defense. And again, I think that's why you got to step back and say, understanding the role of the SIEM has changed. Let's re-envision that. Let's really look at how I can get the most value for the least cost, which hasn't been something historically we've done from a security standpoint. But I think with the proliferation of tools, with the capabilities that are out there, there's a new opportunity to kind of step back and revisit those requirements and say, look, I as a small company, I do need to use my SIEM to do a pretty broad base of analytics. That might mean that I'm going to pay a little bit more, but at least it simplifies my environment from a tool standpoint if I do that. For larger, more enterprise organizations where they have a wider range of tools, they're going to start to look at the SIEM more as a real-time analytics platform and try to park the data that doesn't require real-time analytics, maybe in a data lake or some other form that allows you to search it, analyze it, do forensic analysis and other things, but doesn't incur all the expense and a cost of running that data through a SIEM platform. And again, I think just kind of stepping back and understanding what the current state architecture is for a security operations center, it's bigger than just the SIEM. You're going to have a use case management platform. That's going to make it easier to assimilate alerts from lots of different sources, not just your SIEM. It also gives you some of the other capabilities that you need to sort of efficiently manage these things. Because if you're a small organization, you have to really take advantage of those efficiencies almost more than a large organization does. Larger organizations can live with some inefficiency, but small organizations have to make sure every penny, every dollar, every hour of resource is used as efficiently as possible. And that really does require kind of stepping back and re-envisioning what your requirements are for the SIEM, and then taking a look at the landscape and saying, what's the best product out there that best meets a balance of my requirements, not just threat detection, but a lot of these other capabilities that historically were rolled into the SIEM that are now typically part of other product sets.
Good point. And that's a perfect segue into our next section of this is what are the questions I need to be asking, not just my internal organization, but my SIEM vendor at large. So we're going to go into that, right? The three must ask questions that when you're assessing your current SIEM vendor, is it in line, right? Are they going down the same path that you're going with your security or cyber defense posture? So we've got these three questions that we think are very important that you need to be asking your vendor and your organization when you're looking at maybe changing up the SIEM. So the first one is, of course, what Paul just was talking about. What is your cyber defense strategy? And is my vendor innovating and keeping up and going down the same path I am to meet all my needs? Now, of course, a vendor doesn't say, I'm going to do everything that this customer needs. You have to prioritize and look at, what's the most important things on the roadmap that can have the community at large, not just specifically to one customer, but you got to make sure that this vendor that you have selected is at least in line with your strategy. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, really an important point. And again, I think some of the things that legacy SIEM vendors typically didn't provide. I'll just give you some examples. I know one of the things we typically have to do when we come into a company to help them analyze their SIEM environment is we do an analysis of their rule set. And what we do is we just evaluate the rule set on a two-dimensional scale. One scale is the cyber defense value of that rule. The other is the efficiency of the rule. So the cyber defense value is how valuable is it for me to be able to detect this type of threat? The other thing we look at is what is the issue associated with some of the vertical elements that are associated with the risk profile. And when you start to kind of put it in that framework in terms of what's the efficiency, how many false positives does this rule generate, how valuable is it from a cyber defense value, what we find is that a lot of the out-of-the-box rules are very low value from a cyber defense standpoint, and they operate super inefficiently, which kind of puts them in the worst bucket. That's where the majority of the rules tend to kind of congregate, which is low cyber defense value and low efficiency. That is, they produce a lot of false positives relative to any true positives. We've even analyzed in some clients where, we can look at a year or 2 or 3 years worth of data, and we're only finding 25 or 30 true positives out of all the alerts that were generated. So that's just one example. So if your current vendor doesn't map their rule set to the MITRE attack framework, if you can't get a radar chart of what are the current threat detection capabilities, and if that's not extensible, that is over time as I make changes and add to it, if I can't see that my MITRE attack framework coverage is improving, if I can't see what TTPs I've added for my top attackers and the top techniques and protocols they're using to attack me, if I don't have line of sight to those things, there's just no way for you. Then you're going to have to do all of that work manually, and that adds to the overhead, to the expense, the cost of being able to run it. That's just one example, but that's why you really have to kind of step back and take a fresh look at, is your vendor really providing you with the right capabilities to be able to really support your cyber defense program? And it should be additive to your program. You shouldn't have to spend all your time compensating for the things that the tool won't do. And I think for a lot of organizations over the last, especially 5 or 6 years, they spent so much time overcompensating for the things that their SIEM tool doesn't do, that they've introduced a lot of inefficiency and a lot of ineffectiveness, a lot of times without even realizing it, just as a response to the lack of capabilities in the platform.
Yes. And then that comes down to, maybe I created some out of, not normal workflow or rule or whatever the scenario, and then I move on or I leave, and now they're trying to figure out what the heck did Jason do when he was here, and I don't understand this, so now I got to start all over again. So they'll 100% agree with that. Now we're going to go into this as a very good segue as well, because when you're talking about, okay, my current vendor is not innovating, giving me exactly what I need, it's not lining up. So now I've got to invest a lot of my time and energy to customize my own detection rules, customize my integrations, customize my workflows, because I'm not getting that out of the box from my vendor. But that is something that has to come up into the equation of when I'm selecting maybe a different vendor, what's the impact to me, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about that before is, do I really want to move? And what is the impact to my organization if I switch from this existing SIEM into a new one? are we exposed during this time period? And I've customized so much of this legacy product. Am I going to lose that if I go to a new one? So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, because the SIEM is, as we talked about before, is kind of the heartbeat of your security operations center. Historically, it has been. For a lot of organizations, they've really invested in that platform. They've invested in integrations to a lot of other platforms, to their CTI, to their threat intelligence, to their change management database, to a number of different things. And now, when you start to consider changing to a different SIEM or what's involved in that, you really have to look at how much in a custom integrations you've built around it, how much work you've done to build custom, even log definitions, where I've customized my log definition, and I've customized my rule set, I've customized all my integrations. As you look at these new products that are now out there and the products that are surviving, the characteristics of a lot of those products are they come with APIs. So you don't have to build something custom. There's an API with a lot more capabilities than what you get out of some crazy, Python parser that you've written to try to do something quick and dirty. We see that all over the place. And as you said, when the person who wrote that parser is gone and it stops working, where do you even go in terms of trying to troubleshoot that or figure it out? So I think really looking at the environment that you've put your current SIEM in and understanding what customizations, what integrations, what things you've done, matching that up to, if your product's going end of life or you're dissatisfied with how well it's supporting your requirements, looking at other product sets to say, you know what, it may not be as expensive as I think to move to a new product because they may have built APIs for a lot of the things that I had to custom develop over the last years. And again, that not only reduces your cost of migrating to a different product set, it also reduces your cost of ownership pretty dramatically because you're not having to build and maintain all these customizations that you've built out over the years, which frees up a lot of hours on your team to add new higher value use cases, to work on true investigations, and to spend more time working through positives than chasing false positives.
So true. So true. So a lot of this that we were just talking about can go in different directions, right? Because if we're talking about, all this customization I've done, or I've made my hardcore decision on what telemetry sources I must have brought into my SIEM, what does that mean to this new vendor that I'm potentially looking at? How do you charge about this? What is your out-of-the-box capabilities and your roadmap for future capabilities? Because security operations has a budget, as most departments do. And it's not like it's continuously exploding and they have a blank checkbook every quarter where they can continue to stack more, more funds at it. So the big thing that we're always dealing with from SIEM environments is, the ingestion rates and the costs. So what is a recommendation to the industry in regards to how can I, look at this new vendor? What are some of the selection criteria I have to throw at this new vendor to make sure my costs aren't going to be exploding? I want them to be reducing, not exploding. So what do I ask? What are the questions?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of basic questions you want to talk about. One is, what logs do you ingest? What is the level of discovery you have around the fields within those logs, and understanding where's the sweet spot for this vendor and where am I going to be kind of left on my own to build more custom ingestion, custom XML definitions, et cetera. So I think understanding that piece. And again, if you have a list of the logs that you want to analyze, you should be able to sit down with your vendor, run through that list, and they should be able to coach and help you say, these are the ones that should go into the tool. These can go to a data lake for forensic. These can go to a database that's searchable. But I think that's point number one. I think point number two is looking at the effectiveness of the rule set. How effectively does it cover the MITRE attack framework? What are the key log sources that you focus on for being able to drive that MITRE attack framework coverage? So most of these vendors can provide you some analysis that will tell you, hey, these 20 or 30 log sources are the most valuable log sources. These are the ones you should really focus on, and here are the rule sets that align to those. I think that's an important discussion, and your vendor should be able to carry that discussion with you and point that out. And then I think the third thing is just looking at what are the other integrations that have been built. So what are the things that I've had to do myself as a client to integrate this product into my environment versus what can you provide for me out of the box as integrations and APIs that I can leverage? Because those three elements are the three key cost drivers that we look at in the SIEM licensing and maintenance and cost of ownership. And if you can have a really effective discussion with your vendor to understand what are the target log sources, how comprehensive is the rule set, what integrations can I take advantage of. That gives you an ability in a fairly short amount of time to evaluate what your current investment looks like, and at a high level, what's that migration look like to a different vendor product.
Right. And then also a checklist on that, when, like you mentioned, when you get this criteria set, that should be your success criteria that you provide to that vendor. And another, I think, question that's another good one to ask is, like you mentioned, everybody's going the API route now, which is the most efficient and effective way to do these kinds of flows. But are you charging me every time I make an API call? Right. That's something that's going to explode my cost if the vendor is charging me every time I need to make a connection to a third-party tool, bidirectionally for that matter.
Yeah. And again, having this kind of open discussion with your vendor will give you the opportunity to highlight the fact that, oh, this is a cost of execution thing. Then you can kind of back of the envelope look at, if I'm running that process 50, 60 times a day, is that an affordable approach to this or not? Yep. Excellent.
Right. 100%. So, of course, all the things we've just been discussing, and with the shakeup in the industry right now, it is that time that organizations are dealing with to do this checkup, evaluate my existing tools, evaluate my rule sets, evaluate my flows, and everything else that comes along with that, and make that tough decision. Is it time for a change? And again, there's a lot of fear that comes along with that for organizations, but fortunately, there is vendors out there that can reduce that fear and eliminate that fear, for that matter, because they've been there and they've done it and they understand how to efficiently migrate from a legacy or a other tool into theirs. So I think you really need, it's time to really do that checkup and look at what we need to do when we're making this change.
Yep.
So back to you, Paul, around that, when you're having to take this hard step and you're evaluating your SIEM, there's three things we have on the screen, but the first one I really want you to get your input on is when you're looking at the SIEM vendors out there now, and the new guys coming off of the, that are on the showroom floor at Black Hats and the RSAs that are promising the world, or the legacy ones that have been around for a very long time and battle tested and, proven. What the first side of the gate that we just touched base on is, how do you identify the SIEM vendor to reduce your license costs? What are some of the key points in evaluation there?
Yeah, it goes back to some of the things we've talked about, right? Taking a look at what logs do I want to use my SIEM to analyze, and does this log require real-time analytics, or am I combining it with other logs that have different, time periods, so that the reality is I'm going to do this more in a historical analysis. And again, only a fraction of the threats that we're trying to detect are real-time threats. A lot of the other threats are more effectively detected doing a little bit more of historical analysis, where I can take multiple sets of events and correlate them together to be able to say any one of these things on their own isn't sufficient to generate a true positive. It's much more likely to be a false positive. But really talking through that with your target vendors, explaining kind of, this is where my costs sit today. This is how I'm currently using my tool. This is how I want to be using it. And what would this cost profile look like for me to use your tool to do this? I think that's a critical part of the conversation. And historically, it hasn't been a part of the conversation. It's just been, well, we've kind of intimidated people into just spend whatever you need to spend to get a platform in place. Obviously with all the consolidation, now it is time to kind of step back and look at how you're using it and look at what you can do to optimize. And I think, again, in a very short amount of time, you can target in on what are your key ingestion costs, what are the ways that you're using it, what types of threats are you detecting, and what kind of integrations are you building. The more complicated and sophisticated your requirements are, the more important it is you do a really in-depth analysis of how these different pricing models of different tools will impact what your initial costs are, as well as your costs of ownership.
And I think it goes right into the next point. I mean, you covered it very well about that measuring of your benchmarking and your security outcomes, because price is a very important piece, no question, but is the technology that you're using or evaluating, for that matter, capable of achieving your security outcomes that you have in place? And how easy is it for me to benchmark that and measure the success of that? So I think we kind of covered that. So we're going to move on to the last one, because I think that's the most important piece is, okay, you've evaluated, you've down selected, you've gotten into a couple vendors that you think that you're liking the stories they're telling, you're liking the answers they're giving, but how efficiently can I assess my return on this investment and the efficiency of the migration when it did in fact happen?
Yeah, there's very few clients today that we work with where you where you can't do a SIEM migration in 90 days. I mean, there are going to be a few because the size, the complexity, the data volumes, et cetera, that may take longer. But I think for the most part, once you've kind of dimensioned what logs you need to analyze, what your coverage level, some of the benchmarking we've talked about, really kind of stepping back and saying, what am I paying today versus what could I be paying under a new platform? In a lot of cases, for a lot of clients, when you do that analysis, what we found is that it will largely cover part of the cost or all of the cost of migrating to a different SIEM platform. That's how out of scale the costs are with some of the SIEM licensing and the actual use of those tools is today. And that won't be true for every client, but for a lot of clients, the bad news is you may have to migrate to a different SIEM. The good news, though, is you could actually fund your migration to another platform with all the cost savings by optimizing your use of it, optimizing the licensing. You could potentially fund the investment in a new SIEM platform by the savings you can drive off the old licensing models. And I think that's kind of at the heart of it. And that's something that you can do in a pretty short period of time working with the right people.
And speaking of that, speaking of working with the right people, that's how we're going to wrap this up and talk about how do you get connected with the right people, right? So the next steps after this webinar adjourns, we are going to be sending out an email to all the attendees, but you can also go to deepseas.com and schedule some time with a DeepSea expert to do those assessments, and you get a free 30-minute consultation with a SIEM expert to at least help you on that journey and give you some insights on some of the things we talked about today and some more specific consultative responses into things specifically to your organization and what your journey needs to be. Yeah. So I want to thank Paul so much for spending the time with me today and giving your valuable insights into an uncertain time right now in our cyber world. We've had a lot of uncertainties in it. We always do. I guess it's the life we live. But when it's down to the vendor side of the world, we kind of hope that that's a stability factor in our uncertain world in cyber. But again, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. It's not all gloom and doom. And thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your insights into that.
Great talking to Jason. Look forward to talking to any clients that are interested in kind of better understanding what situation they're in and what opportunities they might have to kind of optimize their program. So good discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a good day.